All right, hello everyone. Hope you're having a good week of no classes. And this narrated PowerPoint will jump into Northouse chapters 10 and 11. You'll see in the Northouse book that there is a chapter 12. I encourage you to read it. It's about overcoming obstacles, but we won't spend time talking about that, and you won't be tested over the content in that chapter. So we'll jump right into conflict and how it's defined and described by Northouse. First, I want to say that conflict is inevitable, and if you're ever in a leadership or management position, you're going to have to deal with conflict. So the real question is, how do we manage conflict and produce a positive change? We often think of conflict as being negative, but it is possible that through conflict, positive change can happen. And so rethinking the way we think about conflict can be helpful and putting a positive spin on it. So today we'll talk about how to define, or how Northouse defines conflict, the different types of conflict, some negotiation and communication strategies, and then the different styles for approaching conflict. As we go through this, I want you to think about how you define conflict and what types of conflict that you have encountered or been a part of in the past, and what your strategies are for dealing with conflict and whether they've been effective or ineffective. So Northouse defines conflict, and in this book we're really talking about interpersonal. Of course there's intrapersonal conflict within oneself, but this book is really talking about interpersonal conflict, conflict between two or more individuals or groups of people. And so Northouse defines conflict as having these four components. There needs to be a struggle, some type of clash between the two people or parties, and then there's got to be some interdependence. What this means is that we have a relationship with one another. We have to rely on one another. If there is no relationship with the person, then often there's no conflict. For example, we see somebody driving down the street who, throws something out his window and he's littering, and, that upsets us, that annoys us. We don't like littering, but the person drives on and we never see that person again. So likely no conflict is going to exist or persist. So it's really important that for there to be interpersonal conflict, there has to be some type of interdependence between the two people. Furthermore, there's then the question of how much influence or how much power do you have or want in the relationship. So in some relationships, we don't want a lot of interdependence. We don't need to have a lot of influence. For example, with our supervisor, we may be okay with the supervisor telling us exactly what to do and when to do it, and we're not going to voice opposition or bring up complaints because in this relationship we understand that we have less power. But in a relationship with a friend or a coworker or a significant other where we want or there should be equal power, then there's more likely to be a conflict because we are going to need to or want to assert ourselves and our interdependence in that situation. Next, there's got to be some feelings involved, and these can, in conflict, there can be lots of different emotions: anger, sadness, loneliness, and often these are strong feelings, and it's sometimes the feelings that prevent us from moving forward or working through a conflict. So as we go through this chapter, we want to think about how can we, despite having these strong feelings during a conflict, how can we effectively manage the conflict. And then lastly, there's got to be some differences. The conflict, why is there a conflict? It's because we have different beliefs, different priorities, different needs, different wants, and often these differences appear to be incompatible, but as we work through the conflict, sometimes we can find some common ground. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but Northouse talks about two different types of conflict: content and relational. What's important to know about this is that content conflicts refer to problems regarding policies, procedures, what somebody's doing, whereas relational conflict refers to how the person does it and how we relate to each other. Often when we think about relational conflict, we think of that personality clash. We just don't get along. We just don't click. And often that's because it's in the relationally, we just we don't like how somebody acts or how they interact with us, as opposed to a content conflict being, I disagree with a policy, I disagree with a grade I received, the content, whereas relational is referring more to the person or the interaction between the two people. And sometimes it can feel like relational is harder to deal with, but both can be challenging. Next, Northouse goes into talking about some different approaches to resolving conflict. And one that they highlight is the principled negotiation, which is model by Fisher and Urey. And this is outlined much more extensively in the book Getting to Yes, which is one of the recommended texts for this class. It's obviously not required, but these couple pages in Northouse book talk about it briefly. If you're interested in this, that book might be helpful for you. But the Fisher and Urey has 4 different principles. So when you're in a conflict, this going through this process may help. I will say principled negotiation doesn't work for every type of conflict. So there's it's appropriate in some situations, but not others. So the first principle is separate the people from the problem. We want to focus on the problem, not on the person, their personality, what they said, how they talk. An example of this might be somebody who's late to work, and the problem is the person is late, but instead of focusing on the problem, which is the person was late, we focus on the person. She's lazy. She doesn't care about her job. She doesn't care about the patients. She's always, stopping to get breakfast before coming in. That's why she's always late. And so that draws the attention away from the real problem. And then we get stuck in this just arguing match about personality traits as opposed to focusing on the problem. So it can be helpful to separate the person from the problem. It's very hard, but if it can be done, it can be helpful. Next is focusing on interests, not positions. So Fisher and Urey talk about positions as these opposing points of view. It's kind of what camp we fall in. So an example might be in abortion. So we have one person who is pro-life and one person that's pro-choice, and that's their position on the issue. But what are their interests? What are their real needs and values and concerns about the issue of abortion? And maybe through conversation, we come to find that both people, the pro-life person and the pro-choice person, both have a interest or need in providing good prenatal care to the woman when she's pregnant. So we can find that we have mutual interests, but we often never get there if we don't move away from our positions. Principled negotiation is not about convincing the pro-life person to be pro-choice or the pro-choice person to be pro-life, but rather to realize, okay, what are the interests? What do we really want to get done? And then focusing on that. Next is inventing options for mutual gain. This is where we want to look for a win-win situation. We often think in conflict, one person wins, one person loses. It does not have to be that way. There's often, through conversation, we can realize, here's a situation where we both win. We both walk away feeling good about the situation. We both get something of what we want, if not all of what we want. So this takes a little bit of brainstorming and sometimes a little bit of compromise, but just realizing that there doesn't have to be a loser can help. Then last is the insisting on using objective criteria. There's not always objective criteria available for every conflict that we're in, but sometimes it can be helpful to find objective criteria that's out there that's unbiased, because the two people or the several people that are involved in the conflict have their own biases, their own beliefs and wants that they bring to the table. So if we can get some unbiased objective criteria to help us kind of think through the conflict, that can be helpful. So one example might be, I'm trying to sell my car and a person wants to buy it for $4,000, but I think it's worth $5,000. Well, what if we use the Kelley Blue Book value, which is an objective criteria for pricing used vehicles based on their year and model and mileage? That's some objective criteria we could use, and that could help resolve that conflict. So this is a really good process to potentially use if you're experiencing a conflict that seems to fit with those steps. There's a link to a video for an example of dealing with conflict that might be helpful. And then we're not going to spend too much time on talking about the other communication strategies that Northouse outlines in this book. Talk about differentiation, which is really defining the conflict and explaining what the differences are and really focusing on our differences so that we can figure out, okay, what are we really arguing about? What is really the conflict? Where do we differ? And once we have defined that and know that, sometimes it's easier to come up with a solution. Or there's fractionation, which is sometimes the conflict is so big that we don't even know where to start. So breaking it down into smaller, more manageable pieces can be helpful. Then lastly, they talk about face saving. What this means is after we've had this conflict, or even in the midst of the conflict, if we can still maintain this ability to help each other feel good about themselves and about the situation, as opposed to tearing each other down and creating a really bad image for each other, that can be helpful. That can also help salvage working relationships going forward. So yeah, we had a conflict at work, but we may need to continue to work together. And so how can we have this conflict and still allow each person to save face? The other big takeaway from this chapter is Kilman and Thomas's model of the different approaches to conflict. And there's 5 approaches that they talk about. And we'll talk about each of them in more detail. There's assertiveness, or they talk about this on a scale of assertiveness and cooperativeness. When you're low on assertiveness and low on cooperating with others, you're likely to avoid conflict. You just pretend like it doesn't exist. There's a conflict, you turn away and run away. Whereas accommodating, again, you're low on assertiveness. You're not going to necessarily say what you want or what you need from a situation, but you'll just accommodate or go along with whatever the other person wants. So we want to go out to eat. You want to go to Pizza Hut. I want to go to McDonald's, but I'm an accommodator. Then we'll just go to Pizza Hut, even though that's not what I wanted. Then there's the competers. Those people are high on assertiveness, but less on cooperativeness. So they don't really care about what other people need or want. They're just focused on what they want, and they're out to make sure they get that. Then there's the collaborators, and this is the ideal situation where we are high on assertiveness. We make sure that our needs are being met, but we also are aware of what other people's needs are, and we try to find a solution where everybody's needs can be met. And then the 5th option is kind of there in between, is the compromising, which is we each get a little bit of what we wanted, but not everything. So an ideal situation is a collaborative approach to conflict where we are assertive and we make our needs known, but we are also aware of others. So then chapter 11 goes into talking about ethics and ethical leadership. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I feel like it's pretty self-explanatory in the book. Northouse talks about ethical leadership in these different ways. Are the leader's character, their actions, their goals, their honesty, their power, and then their values. And we'll talk a little bit about power for just a minute. Northouse uses this little table to talk about the 5 different bases of power, where different power comes from. So we have referent power, which is basically a person has power because they're well liked. And so that's one way that individuals have power, and that being well liked does bring about some power. Then there's expert power. You have power because of your competency in a certain area. Then there's legitimate power. This is power that comes from being a senator or the president or the a judge or the CEO of a company. It's because of your position that you have power. And then there's reward power, which comes from being able to reward people. And so a supervisor is an example of this. A supervisor or manager has power if she has or he has people underneath her. And then lastly, coercive power. And this is the ability to punish. So these are the 5 bases of power. Really good leaders kind of fall into the top 4. And that's all I'm going to finish on